So let's start this off by talking a little bit about AI, what it is, what they're good at, and what their weaknesses are. It's been a very interesting evolution of AI. It started, back in the 50s when it was really just something rule-based, right? One plus one is two. Few decades later, we saw little to no movement, but in the 80s, um, they built something called expert system, and that was really encoded with human knowledge. And then we went through what we call the winter period. And essentially, this means that funding was stopped because it wasn't producing or doing enough for the amount of money that scientists and researchers were putting into it. That quickly changed, I think, in the early 2000s and kicked off what I would consider the AI revolution. And this brought us classical, what we know as machine learning. Um, and then 2010, we saw deep learning neural networks, which concretely brought us breakthroughs in image recognition, language processing, and even things like game playing, right? I'm sure you've played chess against the computer before. That was all machine learning and those neural networks. But more recently, right, a decade later in the early 2020s, we saw something that was a little bit unanticipated, and that was large language models, or what we would consider generative AI. And these models are trained on the world's information, right? They're trained on text and data from the entire World Wide Web. And they also manifested themselves in a way that was a little unexpected, which was a chatbot. Um, because they're so good at language, and that's really what they're good at, they manifested themselves like ChatGPT or Claude or Copilot as something that you can interact with human language. And I think that was the kickoff to practical applications, because something that was maybe once only for data scientists or engineers became democratized, right? And everybody in the world can start using this and start reaping the benefits of AI. Now, of course, it's not perfect, but we know that they are good at processing human language, summarizing big amounts of data or big amounts of content, anything, writing wise, whether that be an email, a protocol, lines of code, a script to do something on your computer. It's quite good at generating that content. Translations, if you've used it for translations before, and even answering knowledge-based questions based on training data. So that often manifests itself as a chatbot in a website. If you've tried to book a vacation before and you've used a chatbot to, rectify something, you know that yes, while they communicate, they're not always the best at it. And that's one of their weaknesses, right? We call this hallucinations. So while they're very good at generating content, they are still machines and they don't have a deep understanding or any understanding of what they're telling you, right? They're regurgitating information that they have been trained on, right? Which brings me to why it's so important to have regulations that govern a lot of these AI models, right? Now, we're going to talk about regulation sort of twofold. One is more generalized, right? So we're referring specifically to the EU AI Act and the ISO 42001. So these are not specific to the life sciences. However, they have laid a foundation for specifically EMA and FDA to take and build off of, that is specific to the life sciences. But essentially, the EU AI Act creates a risk-based regulatory framework for the use and development of AI systems. It categorizes them as unacceptable risk. So think military, swaying population, etc. high risk requiring strict compliance, and lower risk requiring transparency. Um, we fall somewhere between low risk or high risk, right? Depending on the usage of it. But our obligation here and the most important takeaway from this is the use of AI needs to be responsible, needs to be accountable, and needs to be transparent. Okay? Um, and that could mean different things, and I think it's open to interpretation. But what's really important to look at is A, bias in the training data. B, any reasoning or rationale is transparent and traceable, right, to the human. And C, making sure we keep a human in the loop. And we'll talk more about that.